of see foreign policy in the works from inside the foreign ministry. So I joined there thinking that I was only going to stay for maybe 3 or 4 years, and as I said, that was 40 years
40
ago.
years.
Unfortunately, not a lot of what you get here in India is the authentic
Authentic
Mexican
Mexican
food.
food.
We're trying to correct that.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've all have enjoyed a shot of tequila every now and then.
We can't admit it on camera.
Yeah, you can do exactly. One thing that's also happening now in Mexico is Indian weddings.
Yes.
And you know, an Indian wedding is always a very large affair. So whenever there's some of these weddings are taking place in resorts like Cancun, so many Indians, of course, want to go to those weddings. And I always loved very much going physically to a library. There was something very magical about that.
Hello and welcome. You're watching the Geo Interviews. Today we are glad to have with us the Ambassador to Mexico, Federico Salas Lotfe. This is our ongoing series with interviews with diplomats and ambassadors. We are here to learn today between the relationships of Mexico and India, the bilateral trades, the idea of Latin America, and the ongoing ideas of a globalized world and the ever-changing economies and the relationship between the two countries. So I hope we have more questions, more than answers after this interview, and we can learn as much as we can. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for taking out the time.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Sir, you have just completed 35 years of your foreign services. You joined in 1989, if I'm correct. And since then, you have seen so many visits, so many tours. What made you come to the area of diplomacy after graduating from Harvard? And what is it that you have seen in this evolution of foreign policy and diplomacy as your experience?
Thank you. It's actually been 40 years, more than 40 years with the foreign ministry.
Yes.
That I've been with them. Although I became a formal member of the Foreign Service later, after I had joined the foreign ministry. I mean, it's been 4 decades that have been marked by tremendous historical changes and evolution in the international sphere. I was originally, after I graduated from university and even did my master's degree, I wasn't necessarily planning on doing public service. I was more interested in an academic career and focusing on foreign policy and international affairs. And but I had the good fortune that some of my professors when I was doing my master's degree at the El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico were diplomats or were members of the foreign ministry in Mexico. And at one point they invited me to join. And I thought, it would be a good idea to join the foreign ministry to learn from the inside how things work in terms of policy making and, kind of see foreign policy in the works from inside the foreign ministry. So I joined there thinking that I was only going to stay for maybe 3 or 4 years. And as I said, that was 40 years ago. So I'm still here and enjoying it very much.
So, sir, in this transition, you have been in India for almost 5 years now. In September, you'll complete 5 years.
Correct.
So, how do you see these relationship between our two countries and developing the ties?
Well, I have been very fortunate that these 5 years have marked a very important shift in the nature of the relationship between India and Mexico and India and Latin America in general. And I think that a lot has to be attributed, and the credit goes to the Foreign Minister of India, Mr. Jaishankar, who has really shifted a lot of the focus of Indian foreign policy without neglecting, of course, some of the other priorities that India has towards Latin America. And there have been many significant indicators of that. One of them, of course, is the visits that he himself has made to the region. His first visit as foreign minister to Latin America was to Mexico in September of 2022. And then there were other visits that followed to other countries in the subsequent years. There have been 2 embassies that India has opened in the region in this past 5 years. And just in general, I think that he has tried to shift or at least put some of the attention of the foreign policy establishment of India into Latin America. And I think the reasons are obvious. I think that as India has now become a more significant power in world politics, has ambitions to have a global reach and a global presence in international affairs, it needs to extend its footprint into regions like Latin America, where so far it hasn't really been too present.
In that, sir, that reminds me, in one of your speeches during the time of G20 last year, you mentioned that Mexico is a growing economy. Almost 3% of your economy is based on agriculture, and 20% people are still employed by that. So, how do you see this growing economy of Mexico and India in the sphere of bilateral trades and industries to be set up?
Well, the economic relationship between Mexico and India has also been growing, had been growing before the pandemic. There was a lull, of course, because of the COVID pandemic, but it's now growing again. And curiously enough, or interestingly enough, most of the trade that between the two countries is not agricultural, but it's actually industrial goods. A lot of them, for example, in the automobile sector. And that, I think, is very important. But nevertheless, we have a very varied basket of goods that are being exchanged between Mexico and India. And we have become, in this past 5-6 years, the largest trading partner of India in Latin America.
Yes.
And that is growing. We are the largest investor from Latin America in India. And as well, there's over 200 Indian companies that are based in Mexico in a very wide variety of sectors that go from technology, steel, fertilizers, startups, textiles. I mean, just a very wide, and the automobile sector, of course, pharmaceutical. So it's a very rich relationship in that sense, and it's growing. Some of the most significant companies, Indian companies that are in Mexico, have plans to expand, to invest more money, to increase their operation and their footprint in Mexico. So obviously they're doing well,
yes,
and they have a confidence in the future, and that's why they're investing more in their operations in Mexico.
And so, what about investments? How do you see the future investments can be increased, and in what sectors specifically, vice versa, in both countries?
Well, as I said, the number of sectors where India is present in Mexico is tremendously varied, and we have, for example, Tata, who is present in Mexico, TCS, has already expanded its operations into northern Mexico.
Yes.
Other companies, for example, Uflex, which in Mexico is known as Flex America, which is in the recycling and environmental business, is also growing its operations. So it's not a question of pinpointing one sector. I think across the board, and we have new Indian companies that, for example, in the automobile sector, making auto parts, because of course, the Mexican automobile industry is now one of the largest in the world, and many of the auto component companies want to be present in Mexico to be part of this increasing growth. So that's one aspect of it. Another one, of course, is what is now seen as the nearshoring effect. Many companies moving to Mexico to take advantage of the closeness to the largest market in the world, which is the United States. And as you know, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, we have a free trade agreement that's been in force for now over 30 years. And that, of course, gives enormous benefits to foreign companies to place themselves in Mexico. In Mexico, they have many advantages. They have, a very qualified labor force. Many of our states and regions in Mexico provide incentives for the companies to settle there, and again, access to a very, to a thriving market. Mexico as well has a large network of free trade agreements. It's not just the North American Free Trade Agreement. We have a number of free trade agreements that cover over, if I'm not mistaken, over 40 countries, which includes the European Union, and that actually gives us reach in free trade terms to a population similar to the one that India has, of 1.4 billion people. So any foreign company that comes and sets up shop in Mexico has the enormous opportunity of access,
Yes.
if they so desire, to a very broad market. And so the advantages are there, and that's why they're coming to Mexico in large numbers.
Yes, sir. And in this also comes out the idea of a multilateral world and system that is developing. And in that, the ties between Mexico and India, specifically in G20 and United Nations, have been seen to get closer and closer. What are the common goals, in your opinion, that we can pursue as countries?
Yeah. Well, the relationship between Mexico and India, this relationship that I'm talking about, this closeness in economics and also the political closeness that I mentioned with the visits of the foreign minister, it's a relatively new phenomenon.
Yes.
But before that, since India's independence in the late 40s to, I would say, probably the 80s, 90s, most of our relationship, which was a very good one, was in multilateral forums, specifically in the United Nations. We did a lot of work together, for example, in the whole process of decolonization that happened in the 50s and 60s. We worked hand in hand in many ways when India was a very active member of the non-aligned movement, even though Mexico was only an observer of the movement, but we worked very closely with countries like India. We worked closely with India, for example, there was a group called the Group of Six at one point in the 80s having to do with a push to stop nuclear testing around the world. So throughout time, we had a very significant cooperation. This, of course, has extended into the recent past. Just to give you an example, we were both Mexico and India members of the Security Council of the United Nations at the same time.
Yes.
So we did a lot of work together, we have many similar goals in terms of development, of bringing what is now being called the voice of the Global South to have a greater presence in international affairs. And this is something where we see eye to eye with India. So questions of development, of course, questions having to do with the international agenda that are very important, such as the consequences of climate change and how that can be addressed, and many other issues of cooperation from the developing countries that we're working together with India and will continue to do so. So we also worked, of course, as you mentioned, very closely in the G20.
Yes.
That is something that that has identified us. We supported many of the initiatives that India presented last year during this presidency in the G20, and we're still working very closely with India during the Brazilian presidency now, and I'm sure that this will continue into the future. And we have a constant political dialogue between our two countries, and of course, we talk about the issues as they come to the fore, the international issues of concern to all of us. I think this is something that's always present in the agendas of dialogue between our two countries.
And sir, in these bilateral ties, you just mentioned about climate change. These bilateral ties are also important because of a cultural tie that we are trying to establish between the two countries. And what are the cultural and bilateral ties we can establish to pursue these common goals? Because soft power is also a very important tool to tackle these issues.
Certainly. I think that one thing that's important, one thing that we do very much here at the embassy, is that it's important that we get to know each other better.
Right.
I think our two countries are geographically distant, but there's a great deal of affinity.
Yes.
And throughout history, and there's many examples, there has been a closeness that most people are surprised about.
Right.
Like dating back centuries, mind you.
Yes.
I'm not talking even before India itself existed, and even before Mexico as a country was an independent country. There were trade routes across the Pacific that brought many things together, and of course Mexico made important contributions to many things that are now in India. I won't want to mention all of them, but for example, many of the chiles that are the spices that are consumed here in India came from Mexico. The marigolds came from Mexico, and I could give you a long list of things. We also, of course, benefited from things that were coming from India back across the Pacific. But I think that what's important is that we have been able to use this, as you mentioned, the soft power in a very good way. And let me give you a very specific example. In 2019, December 2019, India became or was invited as the guest of honor in the Guadalajara Book Fair. Now, the Guadalajara Book Fair is the largest book fair of the Spanish-speaking world,
right,
and the second largest in the world after Frankfurt. And the fact that India, which is not a Spanish-speaking country, was a guest of honor was very important. But what was even more important is that the Indian presence was not just of a literary nature. For 9 days, which is the length of the fair, India was present with dances, with songs, with food, and not only in Guadalajara, the city of Guadalajara, but they toured around the country. That was tremendously important because it really brought, in a very fruitful way, in a very tangible way, the presence of India to Mexico. We have been, of course, trying also to bring some examples of Mexican culture here. And I'm, let me just give you an example. In the next couple of weeks, we're opening an exhibition next week at the Cervantes Institute here. We work very closely with the Cervantes Institute, which is, belongs to the Spanish Embassy, but we work very closely with them. And we have an agenda of other exhibitions, and we have literary contacts and participation in many events of a cultural nature that take place here in India. We wish we could do more, of course, and there's much more that we can do, but we're doing as much as we can with the limited resources that we have, and that I think is very, very important. We're also trying to build up closer people-to-people relationship. A lot of it has to do with the academic field, bringing students from each country to the other, but as well as establishing, more contact with, professors, joint researchers, joint publications, that type of thing. We're working on that, and we're fortunate enough that there's a significant group of Indian academicians that are very keenly interested in Latin America and Mexico specifically, and in the Spanish language also. So we work together with them quite a bit, professors from universities in Delhi, but all over the country, and they're our allies in helping us bring more Mexico to India. And let me mention one last, but not by that less important example, which is food and drinks. Right. Mexican food is very popular here in India. Unfortunately, not a lot of what you get here in India is the authentic Mexican food. We're trying to correct that and bring more, Mexican chefs and Mexican presence here, so that all of you here in India can actually taste the real food that we have in Mexico. And at the same time, and one thing that is very important is the drinks. Right. Tequila has now become the drink of choice, especially amongst young people. Yes. And I'm sure you've all have enjoyed a shot of tequila every now and then.
We can't admit it on camera.
Yeah, you can't, exactly. But let me tell you something. Tequila consumption in India doubled last year. Right. It's still, not tremendously large by world standards, but it means that, it's
growing interest.
It's growing interest, and it always happens, whenever I go to different places here in India, and I've traveled the country far and wide, in menus, even in a restaurant that is not a Mexican restaurant, they have something that says, Mexican
Drinks.
Mexican salad or a Mexican taco. So obviously there's interest, there's a curiosity about it. And for us, it's something that is a source of great pride because also our cuisine is part of the intangible list of UNESCO of the World Heritage.
Yes.
So we're very happy about that.
Yeah. Sir, my next question would be a rather two-part question because you raised so many points. So first would be the idea of tourism between Mexico and India.
Right.
And how can these tourisms be increased and affect the economy and our relationship?
Right.
And after which, this also brings to the point of academic scholarship, which you also mentioned, and research scholarship. Are there any programs or ideas that are in works between the two countries that can be that we can provide such leeways or pathways for students and researchers?
Well, when it comes to tourism, I think it comes side by side with some of the promotions that we do here,
Right.
of the cultural promotions, because when we showcase something from Mexico here, people get interested
Right.
in my country, and they said, "Oh, I want to go there."
Right.
Or when they taste some Mexican food, they said, "I want to go
Try
over
that.
and try that over there." And tourism has been increasing. Indian tourism to Mexico has been increasing. In the past 2 years, it's been over 100,000 Indian tourists that have come to Mexico. We have, of course, there's the issue of connectivity, which is not what it should be, and it's not cheap to travel from one side to the other. But nevertheless, we're talking about 100,000 people just going there for tourism. One thing that's also happening now in Mexico is Indian weddings.
Yes.
And an Indian wedding is always a very large affair. So whenever there's some of these weddings are taking place in resorts like Cancun, so many Indians, of course, want to go to those weddings, and we're very happy that they're coming, and we wish that more and more this could happen. The same thing is happening with Mexicans coming to India. Many people are coming here to visit this country. I think one thing that is significant is that we are both very rich culturally speaking,
Yes.
countries. And I think that one indicator is the fact that India and Mexico are side by side in the number of World Heritage Sites in the UNESCO list.
Yes, true.
And that's, I think, is very important. And what this basically represents is that we have so much of value, of universal value, to showcase to everyone, not just to each other, but to the rest of the world. And people appreciate that. And people want to go and see those things and be part of it. And so we're promoting that as much as we can, and hopefully this will increase, and that there will be greater facilities as we move towards the future for people to travel from one side of the world to the other, and enjoy and wonder at all these magnificent things that we have to show both in India and in Mexico. So that's when it comes to the tourism side. On the academic side, we have there are programs, there are scholarship programs that exist, and there's many MOUs between Mexican institutions of higher learning and Indian institutions of higher learning,
Right.
That facilitate the possibility of students coming to India and Indians coming to Mexico to do courses or degrees in a wide variety of fields. This is an issue that we need to push harder and increase the numbers and the ease for students to go from one side to the other. But the fact is that it's already happening. In many institutions of here in India, there's Mexican students already working here.
Right. So this also brings to the question of that during research and communication, the idea of language and communication is the most important one.
Right.
And Spanish and Hindi are languages that are almost becoming a global language after English because of the population and the wide reach of the language. And we have had a long cultural ties because of it. In Hindi, we have had people like Nirmal Verma, and in Spanish, because it's such a widely spread language, from Cervantes to Gabriel Garcia Marquez to Mr. Octavio Paz, who was an ambassador of Mexico, but also was a Nobel laureate poet.
Absolutely.
And who took a lot of from the Indian culture and gave back his Mexican ideas and Latin American roots to Indian literature. So how do you feel that the connection of these two languages in this multilateral, globalized world can be seen and potentially used?
Well, I think that's important. One thing that I keep telling Indians who want to learn a foreign language is to focus in Spanish. Because if you learn Spanish, this is something that's very basic. If you learn Spanish, you can speak with the people not of one country, but of 30-some countries.
Right.
It's Spain and all of Latin America.
Yes.
And even a few others. Spanish right now is the second most spoken language in the United States, for example.
Yes.
The U.S. in many parts are totally bilingual with Spanish.
Yes.
So I think it's, sure there's many other languages that are interesting, that are nice sounding, that are useful for many things. But certainly for anyone right now who wants to have a global reach and a global presence, I think Spanish should be the language of choice. Interestingly enough, when we're talking about the Cervantes Institute's main goal is to teach Spanish. And their operation in India is actually their largest operation in the world. More and more people here in India are learning Spanish. They have online courses, they have presence courses, etc. So it's nice to see that there's that affinity towards the Spanish language. And I think that you're right. There have been, of course, important figures from our literary worlds.
Yes.
You mentioned Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz was very significant, not only as a Mexican ambassador here in India, a predecessor of mine, but his reflections that he wrote down in a few books about his experience in India actually made India known to the Spanish-speaking world when those books were published, and eventually to the rest of the world. I think that his contribution to India, so that India became known, and the sort of what India was all about by Octavio Paz, is something that should not be undervalued. I think was very important. The other thing that we have done, and for example, we did this a lot during the pandemic, which of course we couldn't meet personally, but we had a series of virtual meetings between poets from Mexico and poets from India, and reading some of the things in translation to not only to Hindi but to other Indian languages. And as I was saying earlier, that there's this group of professors here or people in academic institutions here in India that are very close to Latin America and to the Spanish language, and they did an enormous collaboration with us. So it was very interesting to see how these literary minds came together, even though it was in a virtual nature. But we had this constantly going on while we were all locked up. And it was a very enriching dialogue between our two countries. And as I said, not only with the Hindi language, but in some cases with Bengali and Kannada and Malayalam, etc. Other languages, where there are translations of Spanish works, and of course, there are also translations of the Hindi works into Spanish, or Hindi and another language.
So that also reminds me of the idea that the epistemology of Paz's work, especially when he was talking about Indian culture, writing about Kali and all the different symbolisms and literary figures and ideas that our culture possess and Mexican culture possess, it was also possible to be widely spread because of the cheap printing publication that was spread all around the countries. Similarly, now publication is on the downfall. technology is on the rise, in which artificial intelligence is there, and also the not just artificial intelligence but industrial technology.
Right.
And other technologies which we have no idea about what the future holds for us. How do you think our culture and our heritage is seeing this transition, and our countries through bilateral trades can go hand in hand and improve and grow with these changing trends of time?
To make sure that this innovations, that these changes in technology do not undermine the cultural heritage that we have. I think that that's one thing that I believe is it's very important. Which is not to say that that we should do away with the technological advances. No, but we should use it to our profit by making more of our cultural richness more accessible to everyone.
Right.
And so that we can learn more about each other. In the case of India and Mexico, certainly that's the case, but also that we can have better access to our literature and for example, right now you can find sites on the internet where you can have access to entire libraries.
Right.
I mean, this is something that a few decades ago was impossible. Couldn't dream of. Even though I always loved very much going physically to a library.
Right.
There was something very magical about that. But nonetheless, I mean, even if it's not going there, but you can have the possibility of accessing all that rich culture and the wealth of information and the pleasure that you can have from reading literature from different parts of the world. So I think that that's very important, and that we should use, make use of artificial intelligence, make it work for us in a much better way, so that we don't become slaves of it, or that we, but actually, see how we can, harness its power, so that it makes us, richer people.
So 1984 is far gone, so we shouldn't worry about that much.
Well, I think we've passed 1984. We're beyond that.
And so then also comes the question, using technology and the benefits that it has, how can we protect, for example, you talked about climate change in the last G20 meeting. How can we protect our environment in climate change, and specifically, what are the ways that technology can be used for it?
Well, I mean, there's nothing new that I can tell you. I think all of that, many scientific works have already addressed the issues that need to be done in order to counter the negative impact of climate change that has already happened, and to put a stop to the continuation of it as we move towards the future. Many measures that have to be taken, like the zero emissions and that type of thing. What is needed now, of course, is the political commitment,
right?
And I also think the personal commitment of each one of us to reduce the many of the things that we are doing and that are contributing to climate change. So as I said, I'm no need to go into all the specific steps. It's already there. We know what it takes, but we should be serious about doing it. And I think that all of our countries need to address this in a committed way. We know that we're far from reaching the goals that we had set up in multilateral meetings in the past. There's the Paris Agreement. As one important document in that regard, but we have to demand this from our political leadership and from the private sector to commit themselves to fulfill these goals, because otherwise, we're already seeing the negative effects of it in terms of all these freaky climate phenomena that are taking place in all of our countries, that are devastating in many ways, and that really should not be happening. And we should revert those situations.
And so, what about industries and the growing industries which are not only in the physical media but the non-physical ones, the ones, for example, online, Instagrams, Facebooks. It is a growing market and it is providing a large chunk of economy to not just our country, but it is a developing economy. What do you see? How do you see this in this globalized relationship?
Well, again, I think it's all of these things I believe are good.
Right.
But there's always, there's a dark side to everything. I mean, what we need to do is, how do you use this? I mean, for example, something like Instagram,
Right.
Or Twitter, now called X.
Right.
I mean, they're extraordinary means to get information, to know what your friends are having for dinner. If
Right.
that's what you want. But but we really need to be careful that this is not misused.
Right.
And we know that this has been misused, and that many people have become addicted to this type of technologies and platforms, and so I mean anything that of these advances in a way. We have to be careful how we use it, be constructive about it, and especially I think the new generations need to be aware that with a proper direction, these platforms and future ones, which I'm sure will come, can be extraordinarily useful
Right.
for all of us.
Right.
But we should be careful that they're not misused.
And so finally, I would like to ask you, as someone who has had a long life experience in diplomacy and the ever-changing tides of global diplomacy and world order, what are the ideas and basic learnings that you have to share with us that we should keep in mind while looking at not just the global order, but also to understand diplomacy and the changing relationships of our international relations?
Well, it's always kind of difficult to.
You can take your time.
But I think that what's important is that, especially, and I'm very glad that this is this young people that are doing this, because I mean you guys have to find ways to be constructive,
Right.
To learn from the mistakes that have been made in the past by previous generations, and even many of us that are still alive, and we've made mistakes, and I mean these things need to be, if not corrected, at least not done again. And I think that's it's up to you. You have this enormous challenge and responsibility, and we've all had it in our time. To make the world a better place for the future.
Right.
How you go about doing that, I think there's many ways. I don't necessarily have the recipe, but I think we were just talking about some of these technologies that exist right now. Harness these technologies in a positive and constructive way, for example. I think that's very important. It's I would say, and this is probably a more traditional thing. I think that you all should study hard, read a lot. I mean, some of these things that seem to be old-fashioned,
Right.
I think are still very valid,
Right.
and they should not be put aside as we move towards the future.
As Hemingway said, the sun always rises. So I hope the sun on our foreheads will rise and new ideas will come.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope that we have more questions and more ideas in our head rather than just plain end-to-end answers. I would like to thank the ambassador for taking out the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching, and for more such interviews, keep watching the GeoStrata. Thank you for your time.